Hey everyone, day 8 of this vlog as we continue to go through this pandemic situation and see that even in the midst of it, God is still at work, that His promises hold true, and that He is a trustworthy God who takes care of His people. Now, there are plenty of times as a preacher, as a teacher, as a communicator in general, that I notice that I've left one of my best ideas or one of the things I really wanted to communicate on the cutting room floor, so to speak, when I get done with a sermon or a lesson. And I did that yesterday, this conversation about being adaptable. And one of the things that occurred to me in the run-up to that, as we talked about the Exodus, being God's people adapting to the famine that was in the Promised Land, and how there was a hard journey to get back there through the plagues and Pharaoh and the wilderness and all of that. And then the early church as well, being adaptable from Jerusalem as a place of persecution, and God scatters His people out. It occurred to me that this the story of God's people is an immigrant story. Now, before we start to make this all political, can we kind of detach that idea of being an immigrant from the kind of political situation and conversation it is in our country, and think about what an immigrant is? An immigrant is a person who's on a journey looking for a home. And we as God's people are people on a journey together looking for a home. And does God promise that to us? You bet. We know where the final place is going to be. Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many rooms," or many mansions even, it's sometimes translated. God's got a home for us when all is said and done. And that brings us hope. But for the time being, we are migrants. We are moving. We are journeying as a caravan of God's people going to the place that He's promised for us. So I hope that gives you a little bit more perspective about how God's people adapt and what it means to be an immigrant. People searching for a home and finding that in Jesus along the way. One of the conversations that's really kind of come up in our culture, or one of the words that I've heard tossed around a lot during this pandemic, is essential or non-essential. I've heard a few people say, "I'm non-essential, so I get to work at home." Or, "I'm essential, so I have to go into work because what I'm doing is important for people to live. We got to have a grocery store that's open and make sure that people are fed. We got to have construction supplies in case people have something wrong with their home." I heard someone had a sump pump break the other day that needed to be repaired. That's an important thing to take care of. But all this to say, I think we as Americans especially, and maybe human beings in general, like to attach a lot of our identity to what we do, especially what our job entails. And if that's not seen as valuable or essential by those around us, by our society, then it can be a little bit frustrating. And a little bit, it makes us question who we are, or our value perhaps. And yet, the value that God places on each of us by virtue of our baptisms, the fact that He was willing to send His Son to die for us, all of that is more important. And that's the message that Jesus is trying to communicate. I was looking at Luke 10 just earlier as part of this conversation. Luke 10, where Jesus has this conversation with Mary and Martha, this famous conversation. Martha's bustling around the kitchen, and Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet and just soaking up His presence and His goodness. And Martha tries to encourage Jesus to say, "Get Mary in the kitchen. That's where she really belongs." And Jesus says in verse 41, "The Lord answered her, 'Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things.'" Does that sound like people in our culture right now? I think so. "But one thing is necessary." One thing is essential, if you want to translate it that way. "Mary has made the right choice, and it will not be taken away from her." So, in a time of our culture when a lot of us are being deemed non-essential to go into work, so to speak, let us refocus ourselves and remember that the one essential thing that God gives us every day to do, to be about our Father's business, is to sit at the feet of Jesus, to soak in His Word and His presence, and to be reminded who we are, that we find our value in who God calls us to be and not who the world calls us to be. Looking at joining Jesus also, and again, I know that, like I said, we haven't really had a chance to do this as a congregation, and in the meantime, kind of journeying through each of these chapters bit by bit. We're looking at chapter 6 today, and so I look at page 65, and an inefficiently effective strategy. Again, you've probably heard me say before that building relationships is what the church is about. And I think that's, once again, something that we want to encourage at Immanuel, in our communities, in our homes, even in the midst of a pandemic, to build relationships. And that's not a very efficient strategy, but you look at how Jesus did things and how effective he was, and it wasn't very efficient. And so look at how we handle our day-to-day interactions. And I love how Finke puts it on page 65. This is the middle paragraph. An agenda of our making is a shot in the dark. Finke's just been talking about agendaless friendship. Like, not I'm going to love you if you like Jesus like me, but I'm just going to love you as a human being for whom Jesus died, whether you know it or not. An agenda of our making is a shot in the dark. Jesus' agenda is a plan from eternity. Great good news. An agenda of our making is ultimately manipulative. It's a bait and switch. I'll extend friendship, but then if you don't love me like I want you to, or you don't love Jesus like I do, then I'm going to back away from this friendship. Jesus' agenda is ultimately redemptive. Our agenda is to have no other agenda than to enjoy the person and watch how Jesus unfolds his agenda. As one person once told me, to have no agenda is so freeing for me. All I have to do is be there to enjoy the person and then respond to what Jesus is doing in their lives. Correct. And so, as we think about this, the way that I would often put it is, we have to know what a person needs, whether it's the presence of Jesus or the proclamation of Jesus. And quite often, people aren't ready for the proclamation that Jesus brings. They need his presence. They need agendaless friendship, and that seems a little wishy-washy to some, I think. But then again, look at the way that Jesus handled people. He enjoyed people. He hung out with those who nobody else would hang out with. And they saw that the love that he had for them, and that translated into opportunities to speak truth into their lives. So quite often, the presence of Jesus in and through us leads to moments of proclamation. And we don't get to pick those times. We don't get to pick that timeline. It's inefficient. And yet, to know that you have a friend who's willing to have a real conversation, that's a precious thing. So I hope that that's a little bit of an encouragement for you on this Wednesday. Well, in about 5:30 or so, I'll have some stuff posted for our Wednesday evening midweek service online, so you can look for that at that point. For the time being, stay in the Word, be well, look out for your neighbors, and I'll see you tomorrow. God's peace to you. Pastor out.